Okay, here we look at part two in the end series here of Alexander the Great and his triumphs and conquest of ancient Persia. And as we've seen or talked about in the first part, he had come up and run into the giant mountain ranges you see that runs through here up to the north and pretty much the known world's edge at that point, and then come down to the south. And what he really wanted to do was grab the Indus River Valley situation and come all the way over because Persia had taken it. I mean, they own it at this point and are very much over that. And of course, the northern part of India was taken in by an Aryan invasion too at a point, and they didn't really want to admit that through the later part of history here. But that's okay, and not really so much in play to this, although I'll probably mention it 3 more times in this video. What we were talking about or discussing here at the end of part one. And if you haven't seen part one, you can go to the very end of this video here in the last minute or so. It'll show up in your top right hand corner, and hopefully you've come here from the top left hand corner of that. So at the end of part one, in your top left hand corner will be this one as part two and lead into that, and I'll put them attached to each other and release them at the same time. But we were looking at the differences between the two of a precise army that's built in this way, phalanxes, and a coalition of an army built in different modes to be able to conquer and do this with 60,000 people versus a large, much larger number of the Mongols whenever they came down, and how it was a totally different idea, concept, or campaign. And instead of being weight of numbers of attrition and things like that, it was actually even a fight that was done perhaps disadvantageous to their numbers or disadvantageous to their way of fighting, and also stretching out their empire in such a manner caused quite a problem. You can see the stretch of this empire whenever the map backs up all the way from Macedonia down to this point, and we're encompassing the Levant, Egypt, all of North Africa, and then across into here. So it's quite some endeavor to even during your lifetime make a trek of this distance, not much less conquer it all and take it under one place. But when the king was relented, who had manpower and resources of the disposed Archimedes fully at his disposal, when majority of the Macedonians with him were permitted to return to Europe, when they would continue their service by holding down the Balkan Peninsula and the Levant to Cyrenaica, in the fresh blood in the standing army of the Macedonians sent out to the east to replace them and continue the fight. As Persia was the largest empire of its day and a superpower at that, which was increased from its original 20 satrapies or provinces by conquest as new emperor, most of them larger than the size of the country from which the Macedonians had originally hailed. It was agreed that it would be too difficult to govern it if it were to continue to expand eastward further and further, so far from his new imperial capital of Alexandria in Egypt. So high command determined to stabilize their hold in the eastern provinces, which extended to the Punjab, and then march back west. It was Macedonian policy to install native rulers in the foreign lands they came to control, as it was thought that it was their new subjects in these places would be well disposed towards them, and such is this case of Poros, a native ethnic Indian, whose formidable power was broken by Alexander, but afterwards greatly renewed under him, being well provisioned with much coin and backed by a strong body of soldiers under a capable Macedonian commander to enforce his authority on the eastern edge of the Alexandrian Empire as a provincial governor or a satrap. To best counter any threat against his buffer state, they then set out to conquer the whole of Arabia, which is the largest peninsula in the world, and then intended to push into North Africa to capture and then weakened Carthage, exhausted from power struggles with Syracuse, afterwards subduing Iberia, and then Italy, to bring the entire Mediterranean under Macedonian domination, as in the loop of the Mediterranean itself, and then this is the battle for Middle Earth. Had Alexander intended to be, it had indeed been defeated at the Hyspides, or India's Vistata, or the modern Jalum, by Porus, as Indian nationalists now assert, then how could the Macedonians create the foundation city of Alexandria Nicaea after the battle, which literally translates as place of Alexandria's victory? on its eastern bank where he bested him. How can you best somebody whenever it was their victory? Is, I guess, the point being made in this. And so, if Alexander had suffered a loss at the former river, then he would not have been capable of campaigning further to reach the high Phasis as he did, and with the Rajah in his remaining forces fight under his command. If he was repulsed after having expanded the former Persian Empire that he had controlled further eastward, then how was an occupying force left in the rear after their departure? In fact, he had instead advanced further instead of withdrawing. As Chandragupta Maurya, who encountered him at the latter river, who afterwards himself defeated the Nandan Empire in 322 BC and united most of India, admitted that Alexander may have easily annexed it to his own empire. Also, the Romans, who were quite envious of this conquest and who attempted to emulate him whenever they did, would no doubt have mentioned it if he did lose. The revisionist myth propagated by Indian nationalists that Raja Porus actually defeated the Macedonians at the Battle of the River Aspades and pushed them back seems to originate with a modern-day theory created by Marshal Gregory Zhukov, who sought to win India to the Soviet cause and therefore may have created it expressly for this purpose, to go against the British people that already had a little bit of bad flavor in India's mouth, although Britain did come there and help them out quite a bit in reunifying themselves, and I don't think they can really deny that to too much fact. But let's continue. Thus, you may have the real reason as to why Alexander the Great and the mighty men of Macedon turned west or back home instead of taking the remainder of India as their own, So it kind of changes things, I guess you'd say, to look at it that way. And I gave him a response back to this, and I'm sorry I'm just leaving it on this one picture here, but I want to show you what I did for his response. It kind of drove me to just go ahead and do this instead of trying to do with a part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Here we are, because that would just draw it out for like an all-day adventure. And I think many people make enough videos about Alexander the Great and so on. I will show you his origins in an upcoming video that I will do, and then one about the whole conquest coming across. And I guess this will be the great thing for the ending of it, and it'll be in a two-part deal showing you the end of actually itself, I guess. But that was written real good, and that itself is by one of my regulars, Cadmos Phoenakau Canaan, almost like Canaan and Anan together, I guess. Anan being tomorrow, Canaan. But Cadmos, and I've seen him on a lot of 7P7's videos, and I tried to find where he had given me this dissertation, or this thing that he had said, and I tried to find it so hard, and I think it's because it wasn't even on one of my videos. It was on 7P7's video where he commented where I was saying something, and that he had asked me to do it there. I don't know. I was pretty sure that on one of my vids he left a link to that, or in some way, and also to one of the videos where the India people were talking crap to him, but I could not find it. I kept going through and through, and I don't know, maybe it was one of the ones where some of these guys will start ranting on one of my videos and they started the whole thing, and if they delete their speech, then it pretty much destroys the thread, and so it may have been down on something like that on one of mine, but I couldn't find it. Watch, I'll find it tomorrow. But anyhow, he resent it to me, so just want to finish with this, where I did tell him, that I thought that his speech there did real good, better than winging it. And whenever I wing it like I do here, I don't use as much eloquent speech. I don't break it down as much as somebody could when writing it. When you write something, you have a chance to go back over it and fill it out and flower it in, make it a little bit more, poignant, I guess you'd say. But a lot of times here I just wing it and I do it with more flavor, I guess. But I had done a video on this before, and it was already a couple of parts, and then I was going to finish it off whenever I ran into this, pretty much where we are now, and I fried the whole thing, and in doing so it got me so frustrated I just went on to other projects. I think I've said in a couple of my videos back at Christmas, I lost a couple, and then after that I ended up losing a whole group of them and a whole sector of my hard drive that I was trying to compile videos on in the first place. So it's kind of changed my way of doing things a little bit here and pissed me off a little bit, so I kind of laid off for a minute. But once I got back with the Cadmos here, I think we'll just go ahead and get right on to it. And so it was kind of devastating for me there, but anyhow, a lot of the things I had were some of the premises for upcoming videos too that I was working on. So again, I have to re-go over all of those, and some of those I'm just putting on a back burner now, and I was really gung-ho for them at the moment, but it kind of sets that off and everything. But you know, just like as a phoenix, I rise from the ashes of despair, and I'm kind of resilient like that some way. It kind of runs in the family because I'm Irish, or I've got a lot of Irish descent. I could do a multi-part one showing his rise, his takeover, bolstering his conquest, his faithful seed horse that he had, easily overtaking many lands, stretching out farther than anyone in history. Sargon, who? But then the Persians' conquest, which had many personal reasons behind it, and its destruction, taking on an already beleaguered, worn-out army who had none could really stand against, and it was a great military strategy that helped to lead that, along with people that were working precise. We use this kind of to this day now in modern warfare. Instead of trying to do it in large, massive numbers, it seems like if we use elite strategic fighting forces, as America does now, we can take out things a whole lot easier than coming in and just mowing down an area, you know. And I think Vietnam showed us a lot of the losses of the way guerrilla warfare would work constantly, and so we found a new way to try to do things. But I don't want to get into that at all in here. Anyhow, back in school, you know, I read a commentary that was very British at one time. It was like a David Attenborough presentation, and I wish I could find it for y'all right now and everything. I tried back then too. It raises hairs on one arm to read it whenever you do. It's like a good book type of thing. And I don't know if you watch any of David Attenborough things, but when somebody really can eloquate it, you know, a lot of times the researchers, and I think that's my problem, I can't do that. I'm not the orator. You know, I yap a lot, but I'm not the orator that somebody like David Attenborough can take and just grab a hold of your tie and keep you suspended, pretty much reading a phone book to you if he did. But, you know, I wish I could, but I also wish I could find it. And anyhow, this man relegates the end of Alexander's conquest to having conquered all that was worth conquering, pretty much to the known world. The Aryans were still over India and not in conflict with him, and did not conflict with nearby settlements. One forgets that the Greeks had settlements at its farthest outpost area, in fact named so, in harmony for quite some time too. They had outposts in that area. The sire Bucephalus had conquered many ancient lands, and running you know, this horse along with Alexander himself had reconquered this lands back through Bactria itself, where horses come from, which is up in this area here, a place that was known for it. But all these lands here of ancient horse lands, so this horse in his own right had done an amazing thing, and now had becoming domesticated, had become a specialized breed of horse, an elite of what his horsemanship was, and not the primordial horses that you saw maybe even the Mongols ride later that had a different type purposes. Horses were bred for purposes, and Bucephalus was a white-faced horse that had really been bred for his purpose and so on. He was a great war horse. War horses are well known through a lot of stories of ancient time as having done a lot of things. In fact, in one of Alexander's campaigns here, some man had been dehorsed somehow, and supposedly, it's a story, that the horse came and laid down beside the man. The man grabbed a hold of the saddle. The horse stood back up and took him to the back. Just on a call. He called to his horse after being dehorsed The horse came in, laid down, probably at his command. They may have had commands at these times to make horses lay down, and he crawled up onto it and it pulled it up. Maybe the man was almost unable to stand, but a neat story. There are a few stories like this that I have, some ancient D&D stuff and everything with war horses. At one time we had a campaign that had those, but in general people didn't pull off things like that as much. Certain campaigns do, but now I'm digressing like hell. Anyhow, so that warhorse had done this, but no longer running wild at this time, but had become for a certain purpose, and a purpose of humanity, and for all of horses. Horses were sacred to Aryans, and reflected this in Alexander's love of his warhorse, who had passed, with Alexander strangely and some quite suspiciously passing after not too long. Alexander, though, is known by all as the Great, and few of all Earth's history hold that title. Alexander's opposition in India didn't hold such a title. It's well known that the British helped to reunify India, and it's well known that the Aryans of old helped to unify it in the past. Told in the ancient stories to this day, yet denied by many, Alexander's pause at India wasn't from fear nor lacking his ability. For with the remnants of Persians, with his own, he was an unstoppable force. Just had relegated 30,000 new infantry into it, and it's about to talk about it here in itself, right at the ending of the video part that I'll show to end this off. And India should be thankful and less critical, and surely not boastful of their past as a conquering power, given its reality and scope. And I don't know if people are thinking about it in the correct way right now or not, but in one way certainly, that if Alexander would have just lost outright here, India wasn't posed or set in any way to start conquering these lands over here in any way, shape, or form. It really wasn't set up to do that. That wasn't the idea, concept in any way, shape, or form either. So to have come across the way that they do sometimes, and possibly to this man, and some videos that we've seen here that kind of said this or whatever, his pause at India wasn't from that lack of ability either in any way, shape, or form. Unique and brilliant, Aryan influxed India is a shining star of the world. This issue that we're talking about is neither a disgrace nor a boon, except in the assurance that he did not want to invade or destroy India. It seemed he had respect for it. Sadly, it seems India doesn't reciprocate nowadays, even though he did them no permanent harm, and this leaves them with their great culture they still have today. India did not reach far past India, as I was just speaking of, but a Macedonian youth reached across the entire known world. And so let's finish off what they say here when we're looking at the river Phasis and how things go. And they say his armies mutinied and all these things, but they pretty much had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, scarred and battle-torn, yet eager to follow him on to the next river. But once they reached the next river and found out it was the next river, I think they had it, because the river they were at was the end of the purple. And why should we keep going? Why don't you come back and rest in your kingdom and let someone else start to do this attacking? And I believe he agreed, although it's always looked at as that he was angered by the fact that he couldn't go one step past the known world. So many of these had not seen their homes in 8 years. They'd heard rumors of gigantic armies waiting for them in India, and these elephants and so on. It looked like it's just going to be a huge battle, and they refused to really go any further. And so they left. Alexander supposedly furious, but he in turn just turned the army around of these great warriors and heroes. He followed the rivers of the Punjab to the sea. A journey on the way, he defeated the Meledians, but also while leading the assault on their capital, he was wounded in the chest and nearly killed, and this might also eventually lead shortly to his death, which comes later, of strange fever, supposedly, is the way that it's expressed. But anyhow, they traveled down the Indus, and really unimpeded from that one point. On reaching the coast, part of his army under Nearchus boarded ships and returned to Persia, leaving by a waterway by sea, sailing through the Straits of Hormuz, entering the Persian Gulf. And by this Hormuz, and we have this Ahura Mazda and the concept of the straits that run through there. And this is almost, this is an unseen voyage, much like you hear the tales of the brave Odysseus and all those type of things. And then they had to do this and enter into the Persian Gulf. So it was, a special voyage for him, but most of the military, of course, ended up going by land up right across the end of the bottom of the Persian Gulf again. And it was one of the great ancient voyages of exploration. These waters had been previously unknown to the Greeks, and by doing so, again, it was a great travel. They'd come, and they came up back into the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. Meanwhile, Alexander led the rest of the army back to land through the Gedosian Desert. This Gedrosian Desert here, this is where you actually would start seeing some of the camels and stuff that later get taught over there. Extreme heat and things really caused a lot of problems, and he had some deaths among his army. And so, exhausted on their return to Persia, Alexander ran into here, and then he ran into a problem. He had found that Alexander executed several of his viceroys and governors, and these were men that were left in control of the place. It's called Purge of the Viceroys. He's accused of ruling unjustly, robbing temples and tombs during his long absence in the east. And when people say, oh, he came to Persepolis and he did and all this type of stuff, it wasn't really sacked to the point that people think of or see the ruins of today at the point when he first came through. But when he had come back through, the place was not what it was at one time. And I think he and himself wanted to keep this as the farthest outpost of this way, being able to reach it armed to the east, still close enough to reach itself to the Euphrates River. The Euphrates and the Susa attaches over all the way. You can come up through Anatolia and then Egypt and so on. And so there's this handshake running across the government, and that they're right here in the center of this, and what was the great Persian Empire, they had pretty much just ransacked it and destroyed it. Anyhow, he managed a magnificent mass marriage with the Macedonian officers to 80 Persian noblewomen, signifying and joining into a truce here with them, strengthening the bonds between all the two kingdoms, and they call it the weddings at Susa. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses, and he also paid all of his soldiers' debts and ordered 30,000 youths from across this empire to be brought into and trained in the Macedonian arts of war, and they were to replace all of his army. And now the heroes could go into their elder age of being very prosperous and no longer being in war, and they could become the great knights of old. But at Ophis, the troops tried to mutiny again as he just runs, and if you look, he's kind of headed home at this time. They were offended by Alexander's apparent preference for the Persian advisors, and the Persian ways of doing things still over here on the other side of the Euphrates. And it's kind of seen as been somewhat of a conflict. A lot of people say different things about this, and it's different aspects, as a lot of history can be looked at in that way. But because he leaves alone empires and lets them run as they were and just leaves them under taxation, and other people before had really dominated and never adopted their ways. And so, when he's in Persia and he wears a Persian outfit in front of the people, they're like, what the hell are you doing? And he's like, hey, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But that wasn't popular yet, was it? No, it wasn't. But it sure came popular after that. And an understanding that you don't want to just sit and piss people off and try to ruin their heritage. What you really want to do is just let them continue. If they were prosperous enough to attack in the first place and take, then they're prosperous enough to leave alone, even kind of bolster in some way to see if you can get trade better out of them and things. Tax it a little bit, you make money off of it, it becomes a greater empire. It's not a ruining of you, it's a more of, hey, all of us time of concept. It's a little different. People still look at it strange to this day. Anyhow, though, he had ringleaders executed and made a speech to the men, and he was reminding them of the glories that they had won together in all of their travels. And this is a great speech, supposedly, that they have locked down here. And it led to an eventual and an emotional reconciliation of everybody. And so they were able to get it back together somewhat. And then Ecbatana, Alexander's closest and most trusted friend, though, Hephaestion, which name has to do with heat also, ended up dying of a fever, and this devastated him pretty bad, because this was almost like Gilgamesh losing Enkidu, and it was pretty bad. The king was grief-stricken. He went days without eating, supposedly, and ordered a period of public mourning. And during this time, it was sent out through the lands there, that across the empire itself, that this was to be a time of mourning for a little bit for him. And Alexander waged a successful campaign against the mountain raiders of the Cossii, and this has something to do with Cossacks later too, but I'll get into that whenever I talk about northern steppes, which are, these people are nowhere near the northern steppe at this point, but that's another point. Anyhow, leaving there and returning to Babylon, he was met by embassies from distant peoples, coming together to recognize his greatness. Ethiopians, Libyans, European Scythians, Lusanians, Etruscans, Gauls, they all came to see him. And of course, he already had respect of the other Scythians who were on the other side, and even Iberians came. So people all the way from Spain, Gauls, Etruscans, Lusanians, Libyans, Ethiopians, all came to recognize Alexander's Bactrian wife, Roxana, was now pregnant. And so he was to lead perhaps an heir if it was a boy. But as he planned his next campaign to Arabia and beyond, he developed a sudden fever and died days later, aged just 32, some 10 years of his campaign from when he had started, 22 to 32 years, pretty much encompassing almost a biblical age, if you will. Hint, hint. It may have been malaria, cholera, typhus, perhaps even poison, and some people believe that the wound that almost killed him eventually got reopened again somehow. But the successors that came from that, Alexander died undefeated. His reputation as a brilliant, fearless, daring military commander remains undimmed to this day. This is taken from a wall mosaic and painted into a modern painting of Alexander himself here, showing one of the elder lances, the longer ones, and how he had run up through and run through one of the others that were Persians in the fight. Somehow he doesn't have his sword out at this point. No one knows what happened just right before this moment, but also in doing so, you can see that he had touted to have had blonder hair whenever he was young, and some say that he had one blue and one green eye. Some people say one blue, one brown eye, that he was half divine from that blue-eyed situation. And Darius here, you can see, is definitely looking like an Aryan calling out to him and such. But only a few people are known as the Great. His decade-long campaign created one of the largest empires ever known, stretching from Greece all the way to Pakistan to the edge of India, up in the north to near Chinese areas and the areas that we talk about, and the Proto-Europeans and stuff. It was vast and unstable, though, and held together really by only his own brilliance and his own name, and somewhat short-lived, as now that they were conquered, you would have to keep them in line, in check, pull them together as a unified thing. Some of these reach too far apart, and that's the reason that a lot of times in ancient times people ended up developing quite differently. You can tell the Indus River Valley coming all the way over here to Samaria is quite the endeavor. In fact, instead of meeting in this way here, where they seem to have met is across the river and coming into and meeting him here at Maluha. That this is one world, this is another world, and we're not even looking at the one that most people listening today are probably familiar with around the Mediterranean, Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and the places that are so much more familiar. But this Tigris and Euphrates leads right up to it. So shortly after this point, everybody started breaking it up, and they break it up into generals that had run, He left no plans for his succession, and his generals soon began fighting among themselves to carve out their own empires, which you see kind of shown here. You can see the Cassander, the Lysimachos, and Tinogus, the Seleucid Empire here, and Ptolemaic dynasty, which was run in Egypt, and how this started it off somehow, and the areas that would be controlled, but some of these areas weren't controlled too well, and again, these people and a lot of their ethnic culture in those pulled back up into Europe as this area slowly became more and more a wasteland, and different people are kind of in that same area today, if you will. Wars of the successors of Alexander's widow Roxana and Young were soon killed. His own gold sarcophagus en route to Macedonia came up for burial, was hijacked, and ended up in Alexandria. And today its location remains one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. And we've looked at that a few times and where he could actually be. Few men have ever had such an impact on the course of history as Alexander the Great. Few men get the title of the Great. The breathtaking achievements of his short life ushered in the Hellenistic age, as Greek ideas spread across the territory of his former empire, fusing with local traditions to trigger off new developments in art, science, government, and languages, and herald forth what we actually carry today. Some of those successor kingdoms to his great empire were short-lived. Others endured for decades, even centuries, but all in turn would fall to new forces, and in the West, to the rising power of Rome, which became the next great empire to take over after this point, and its great armors that it carried. Anyhow, guys, like, share, and subscribe. A lot of the pictures that were used in here were from Osprey books, mixed in with video footage from a few war games, and I thought that was pretty neat. I will put a connection link to the guy that originally started these. He has a whole series on this, and I really just picked apart a few moments of it to help show this end part here. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. Peace.